Hi, this is Editing V. I just wanted to tell you that this is going to be a long video, so I recommend grabbing a bowl of your favorite Vietnamese noodle soup and settling in. Hi everyone, welcome back to Critical Healing Moment, and if you're new here, my name is V, and this is my channel where I talk about social work, organizing, social justice, all that stuff. So before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick little plug for you to subscribe to my channel. I'm almost at 100 subscribers, so I know it's not a lot, but it's super exciting for me to have grown this organically after starting my channel just at the beginning of this year, and to also follow me on Instagram. The link to my Instagram is down in the description. Today, I just wanted to do a kind of get to know me and my story kind of video. So I just want to also start off by saying that this video was inspired by Hyuni, who is a Korean American social worker and YouTuber, and you can check out her video here and down in the description. I started watching her videos when I was curious about social work, and there are not that many social work creators on YouTube, and so she was one of the only Asian American social workers, so I thought that that was really cool. So she did this video where she answered a few questions about her experience as an Asian American social worker and mental health practitioner, and I really liked her video, and I also there's a fly in here. And I also felt like having only one perspective of being an Asian American social worker is not enough. There needs to be more perspectives because the Asian American community is so diverse, and I really wanted to share some parts of my story so that maybe some of y'all out there may be able to relate to them. So the first question is, what is your ethnicity and multicultural experience? So I am Vietnamese, as you may be able to tell, and also like with this, and like with this, and this, and so I am Vietnamese. I am very proudly Vietnamese, and it hasn't always been that way, but my experience was my parents are refugees from the Vietnam American War, and they came here separately, so they didn't know each other before. They came to America when they were teenagers, and I grew up in a very small town in the suburbs that was very white, and it has been a really complex journey in terms of me being in touch with my ethnic roots. So as I mentioned, the hometown where I grew up was a pretty small town, and I would say that there were a couple other Vietnamese families around, and like we all knew each other kind of. But when in terms of like going to school and stuff like that, I went to school with primarily white students for the most part, and then in some parts of schooling also went to school with slightly more diverse students. As diverse meaning I went to school in the city, so there were more Black students, and I could go into the whole like busing and school segregation, all that, but that is not for this video. Yeah, it was really, honestly, I kind of lost my train of thought here, but what I meant to say was that after meeting people who were Vietnamese and grew up in really big Vietnamese communities, I came to realize that my family was honestly like a family next door. I grew up with a lot of my family members and relatives, and we were pretty close-knit, and a lot of people kind of knew us, especially like in the church community and things like that. And other than the fact that we were Vietnamese, I would say that like we were very into suburban culture. And so my family was where I primarily learned Vietnamese culture outside of the time that I attended Vietnamese language school for a couple years. In the beginning, didn't really want to participate in it. Even though I did enjoy it, because I like personally for me, like I feel like one of my sort of lifelong qualities is like a joy of learning things, and so I did enjoy learning Vietnamese, but I didn't like the social aspect of Vietnamese language school because I felt like I was being forced to socialize with other Vietnamese people, and like outside of my family I had no reason why, you know, I didn't believe that it was important or that I needed to do that, and I just felt really also out of place. You know, having to go there like every other weekend and spend like a few hours in the classes and having to socialize with the other people my age who are Vietnamese, I always felt really disconnected from that. And then it wasn't until I went to college that I really was invested in reconnecting with my specific ethnic heritage, that kind of led me to where I am now. I'll just leave it at that. I don't know if I'll be able to talk about it all, you know, all of it in one question. So the second question is, growing up as Asian American, have you felt that you faced more expectations from your parents to achieve greater success than your peers who are not Asian? Okay, so this is really the question that I really wanted to provide my perspective on, because I think this question, what's the word? This question is a leading question. It already has an assumption that this is how Asian American parents are, and I did not feel that way with my parents. I felt like I was very much a self-motivated person who wanted to do well in school for the sake of learning, like I said before, and it wasn't really motivated by grades at all. And I didn't feel like any pressure from my parents to have to be in a certain field. I do think that their ideas of what career options were and things like that were very limited because they didn't know sort of like all of the opportunities that are available in the US. However, I didn't feel like there was this pressure to study all the time or anything. If anything, I would create that pressure for myself because I just loved learning and I wanted to challenge myself, and I love being challenged. So that wasn't really there. And so I really think that this is a stereotype about Asian parents being tiger parents. And I think that stereotype is really toxic to Asian American mental health as well, because there's all sorts of assumptions about what is Asian parenting. Also, like, Asian parents come from a plethora of different backgrounds, whether it is by ethnic backgrounds and class backgrounds and how they came to the US. So I don't really like pushing around that narrative. I think for me, some things that I heard growing up was that knowing that my parents struggled in school as well, they understood that school was difficult and they were accepting of not getting, you know, straight A's, although I did get straight A's until like 9th grade. Yeah, I don't like this question, but I really wanted to answer it. Question number 3. Which mental wellness related issues have you personally experienced or thought deeply about? Yeah, so my whole really interest area in mental health is intergenerational trauma. Being that my parents were children during a war and then they came to the US, I feel like that has had a huge impact on me at a very subconscious level. And so this has been something that I've been sort of unpacking for the last 5 years for myself, and then also connecting with the broader Vietnamese community on really what does this mean, how does this show up in our relationships and in generations further down the line. This has been my sort of passion area, and really I think that it's being more commonly talked about, intergenerational trauma recently, and being applied to more broad communities, and even white communities, I guess I'll say, because really it's a term that refers to how trauma experienced by previous generations to not become unlearned and then become embedded in parenting and family dynamics and things like that, and then passed on to children who then repeat the cycle. And so if you're not able to break that cycle of intergenerational trauma, it'll just continue. And intergenerational trauma is a concept that really started in looking at Jewish communities and Holocaust survivors, and that's where a lot of the literature and research has been done about intergenerational trauma. However, more and more research is being done about how intergenerational trauma impacts other communities in other ways. So, for example, intergenerational trauma has been applied to Indigenous communities, especially like during the time when Indigenous children were being taken from their families and put into boarding schools, and how that has impacted Indigenous folks in the US and how that impacts generations today. There's been a little bit of literature on concepts like post-traumatic slave syndrome for the African American community in the US. And of course, my favorite area to talk about is intergenerational trauma in the Vietnamese community, because there's so much trauma that comes from a situation where people of your same ethnic and national identity have been fighting each other. And I'm referencing to the Vietnam War, which was, as I like to remind people, a civil war before it was an imperialist war. So, and related to that, you know, all of these things that I mentioned, right, there's usually an aspect of social oppression that replicates or creates the initial trauma that makes this very unique, where intergenerational trauma is sort of coupled in with all sorts of things around like your ethnic identity and your culture, because it's not only the process of those traumas, but also the process of sort of removing people from their history, which applies to Jewish communities, Indigenous communities, Black communities, and Vietnamese communities. So it is the topic that I love to read about and love to talk about. Question number 4. How has your culture shaped your identity? So this is just a lot. Like, culture is everything. And what I mean by that is that culture is not something that only people of color have. Everyone has culture. The way you live your life and the values you have, the food you eat, the music you listen to, all of that is culture. And all of that, even if you're a white person, impacts your identity. And I know a lot of white people do not think about this. So my culture has been everything, and my culture is very specific, and that cannot be boiled down to just being Vietnamese American. I really think there are a couple things that come into the culture that I grew up in, and the first one being, yes, that I am Vietnamese American. The second one being that my family grew up, or like I grew up Catholic and with the Catholic side of my family, because that is a very specific Vietnamese culture, is Catholic Vietnamese culture. And I also grew up middle class, and I grew up in the suburbs, and I grew up with parents that speak English. And so I really think that this all impacts my identity, because every time I meet another Vietnamese person, while there are so many similarities between us and our experiences, my experience I've found to be very different, because like there are not that many Vietnamese families that grew up where I grew up, and that area had a very specific culture. And so how has your culture shaped your identity? It has, my culture is my identity, basically. Question number 5, how did you find your calling in social work? So I have a hard time like really pinpointing a specific moment, but so I had been working with young people for the past 3 years, and then before that, like, I also work with young people kind of off and on in sort of a volunteer capacity. And so in my work with young people was when I really started to interact with social workers. And now I don't think that I knew what a social worker was or what social workers did when I was in high school and thinking about what, career I wanted to go into and what major I wanted to study. I had no idea. That really, reveals my privilege as someone who was from a background that didn't require knowing what a social worker was. Whereas in other communities and other class backgrounds, social workers are maybe more prevalent in your everyday life, whether it's in your school, in the different community groups or functions that you were a part of. Maybe there's a social worker there on staff. I did not have any life involving social workers until I became a professional myself. And so when I was working with young people, I would learn more about what social workers did, especially in the school environment. So I would, work with young people and sort of build community partnerships between my organization and schools. And usually, people like social workers or school counselors would be the people that I would talk to in terms of partnering in the development of a young person. And so that's kind of when I saw, social workers, they work in schools. I also just mentioned that my first year field placement will also be at a school. So I'll be in that place, even though that's not the type of social work I want to do in the future, but I'm really excited to learn. But it is kind of where I first interacted with a lot of social workers. Now, when I was thinking about what I wanted to go back to school for, I had decided that I wanted to become a therapist. And so I was looking at a lot of different options, right? There's so many pathways to becoming a therapist. You can go into marriage and family therapy, or you can go into school counseling or educational psychology, or, there's psychology, counseling, all of this stuff, right? The reason why I landed on social work was actually, I believe it was because I started listening to this podcast. I think it's called the Black Therapist Podcast or something like that. So I was looking for mental health podcasts created by people of color, and this therapist was a social worker. And there was this one episode where she explained the path to becoming a therapist from studying social work. And so I looked into it more, and I really honestly just fell in love with the field. The reason why I really love social work is because it is a field that has such a range of what you can do. You can go to the clinical micro side, which is what I'm studying, but I also really love the macro side, which is stuff like community organizing, social change work, even like nonprofit administration type of stuff. So I really like the whole spectrum of what you can do. And like, something about me is I know a little bit about a lot of things, and I don't really see myself as really an in-depth expert in anything, but I do know a little bit about a lot of random things. And so I think that this just really falls, social work really aligns with that. And also in my career later on, and the lighting's changing because the clouds are covering the sun, I want my social work practice to be able to cover a wide range of services, from therapy, from therapy to program evaluation, program design, research, training and facilitation, technical assistance. I want to do all of that, and I really felt like social work was how I could get there. The other thing about social work was I felt like it was going to be a faster timeline, because some other master's programs will take longer. You need other kinds of prerequisites and things like that before you can start practicing. And I do not want to spend my whole life in school. Even though I love learning, I think what I love doing more is doing. And so I was really excited to just like get it over with and just start practicing in the community, because that is what my ultimate goal is. Another thing about social work is that I really appreciate the code of ethics. It's so central, and I didn't know how central it was when I was applying to school, but sort of after the fact and when I was talking with people who had been in the field for a while, they usually talk about the code of ethics and how it makes the field stand out, in terms of, you know, whether you want to pick social work versus counseling or social work versus psychology, for example. Social work has this sort of social justice values component. It is by no means perfect, but it is better than sort of the standard psychology program. And then on the macro side, you know, you could do an MSW or you could do a master's in public policy, but in social work, you do have this sort of, you look at issues, you look at social issues through a social justice lens. And so that really resonated with me as well. Okay, next question is, what is your current profession and how did you decide to pursue that career path? Well, I am unemployed, but I used to work with young people, so I guess I'll talk about that. So I honestly got into working with young people kind of by chance. I did this fellowship program after I graduated college, and this program places you with different organizations that do community organizing work or civic engagement work across the US in Asian American communities. And I just wanted to work with Vietnamese people, and this is kind of going back to my whole journey with my ethnic identity. That's all I really wanted to do. It didn't matter what I was doing, who I was working with, or anything, but I happened to be placed at a youth summer program. And so that's when I really worked with young people and engaged with them in sort of a professional capacity. I've always had lots of younger cousins and siblings and stuff like that. I'm like one of the older people in my family, of like my cousins. So I've always been surrounded by younger people but never worked with them, and that was really my first opportunity, and it was kind of by chance. I completely love that experience. It was very formative for me. And then after I did that fellowship, it was kind of just for the summer. I worked in consulting for a year and a half. While I was in consulting, I also volunteered because a lot of companies, especially a lot of bigger companies, they have like corporate volunteer hours. And so I also volunteered with a school during that time and like supporting young people in sort of like career readiness, making resumes, doing job interviews, that kind of stuff. And so I went back to working with young people. When I decided to leave that industry, I was also just like, I just need something new. And I was applying to all kinds of different nonprofit jobs in various issue areas. And the timing was just right where I found an opportunity that worked with young Asian American young people with an organization that did stuff that was very similar to that summer program that I worked on like a few years back. And so I was just really coincidentally found an opportunity that was really aligned with my previous experiences. And I stayed there and did that for 3 years. And I learned so much about like youth work and youth development during that time that was really shaped me. And then now I am going to be interning at a public school as a social work intern. So I'll still be working with young people, but it'll be in a different setting. I was really interested in learning about the institution of school and education versus sort of supporting a young person in their development and education as outside in the community. So I'm really interested in the institution, especially knowing that I'll be working in a sort of an inner city school, as some people might say, just like in a school with predominantly Black students where there is likely to be a huge presence of like police in their communities, a lot of families that have different needs to be met, and also students who have learning disabilities and other kinds of mental health needs. So that is going to be something completely different than the other work that I've done with young people. So I guess that is my current profession. And oh, the second part of this question is, how did you decide to pursue this career path? And I think it was by chance that kind of led me to it, but what I really loved about the field and why I continue to work in it is that I really like the process of education outside of the classroom, because it's like really experiential learning, and it's sort of this pedagogical method. When I was working in that fellowship, I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, which is one of my favorite books. And it's all about sort of flipping the dynamic between teachers and students and using it in really using it like a popular education model that I really like. And so I really liked engaging with young people in that way, and supporting them in meaning being able to ask them questions and have them think about their own experiences in a critical way. That's what I really liked about working with young people, and that they like always had new ways of thinking of things. And I liked being able to be that adult in a young person's life, because I think that for most of my life, the traditional sort of adult and young person dynamic was always there. And I was a naturally sort of curious and critical person, but like it would have been really nice to have someone to kind of like lead and develop me, I guess, into a person. Although I don't like regret anything about my past, because that's how I end up where I am today. Question number 7, what was your initiative to starting a YouTube channel? So honestly, since I was a teenager, I've always wanted to become some sort of lifestyle blogger. I was really into blogs like when I was younger, in high school and college, and blogs are kind of now like not so popular, but I really liked telling my story, whether it was just like, you know, things I found at the thrift store. And I used to be really into like thrifting and DIYing. That's kind of what my initial storytelling was. But I really liked, you know, sharing about my experiences and my story ever since I was young. And I always wanted to try to go into a video format, but it was always very nerve-wracking to me to have to like verbally share things. Was much more comfortable writing about my experiences. However, I felt like YouTube and a video format was a way to tap into a new audience. Obviously, like I said, not that many people read blogs anymore, and so I felt like I had to adapt to be able to share my story in a new format. And so really that's sort of the initial reason for me starting a YouTube channel. And then more specifically, I really want to be able to share my thoughts, my experiences and stories around social justice, organizing, mental health, healing, and all of that, and really be really have a unique perspective, because I do think that I have sort of a original take on things sometimes. Not saying that no one has ever thought the things I've ever thought, but I feel like they need to be uplifted, and I want to use my channel to uplift those perspectives and really create broader change in society. Question number 8. Are there any changes in people's perception of mental wellness that you hope to see in our Asian community? So I hope that we can be more trauma-informed in Asian communities. A huge pet peeve of mine, and I think it's too big to be a pet peeve, but a huge criticism of mine of Asian American mental health is this constant blaming things on culture. And I already talked about culture in this video, but I would like to decouple this idea of Asian culture being a monolithic and homogenous thing and mental health, because the Asian American experience is so diverse, and we have to take into consideration that culture is not stagnant, it changes. And so when people come to the US, they have to adapt their culture, and that adaptation process is also traumatizing for some people. And so I would like to really have us be more trauma informed in working in Asian American communities and talking about mental health, and not just saying things like, oh, you have depression because your parents are strict because they're Asian. That is way too simple of an explanation for something as complex as mental health and as trauma. So that is my huge thing. I actually have like a whole written series about it on a blog that I ran for a little bit, and so I'll link that in the description if you want to read kind of more of a written casual academic style. You know, I do provide like research and statistics and that kind of stuff, like, but it is kind of written in a casual way. It's not like super academic paper. I do have a blog about that I made, I think 2 years ago, and so you can check that out in the description below. And last question is number 9. Any advice for Asian peers who are struggling with self-identity or mental health challenges? My advice is that you are not alone. I think that there is a lot of stigma, and a lot of folks are isolated in their relationships where maybe they're the only Asian American person in their friend group or in their town even. Or maybe you feel like your specific challenges are like, even with among other Asian Americans, they wouldn't understand. I think that is not the case. So there are people out there who relate to you and are going through the same things that you are going through. And the most important thing is to sort of reach out and try to find that community so that you can talk to people. When I was in college and I was struggling a lot with sort of the beginning, not the beginning of the intergenerational trauma, but like the beginning of me sort of putting together like all of these symptoms of intergenerational trauma when I was in college, what was really helpful for me was online groups, especially like Facebook groups. I don't engage with them anymore because they're too much for me, but I really found a community in this one group that I was in that doesn't exist anymore. And in that group, I was able to connect with people who, I could talk to about these things, because at my school, there wasn't that many Asian Americans. And among the ones that I interacted with, most of them were not Vietnamese. And I also felt like they weren't going through the things that I was going through. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but like not many folks were talking about it. And there's always the advice of go seek professional help. I think that is an option if that is something you're comfortable with. And I know that it is very challenging to find a therapist or counselor that's going to be able to relate with you, especially if you are in a community without many Asian Americans, let alone Asian American mental health providers. And so I would say just find some sort of support network, whether it's an informal one or formal one. Yeah, and just tell your story. That has been what has been the most helpful for me, is to tell my story, because whenever I do, there's usually someone who's like, wow, thank you for telling your story. Like, I didn't know anyone else was going through this. And that process alone is like very healing, just to know that people have gone what you've gone through, and that by also talking with them, you're helping each other, right? And so then there's this whole thing of like community care, which I kind of chatted about in my last bullet journal video if you want to hear more about that. But it's just really building a support network and not being afraid to sort of tackle the problems. All right, and so that was my experience being an Asian American, my Asian American story, my Vietnamese American story. As you can see, like, my journey to social work has been sort of deeply part of my experience and how my ethnic identity has sort of interacted with mental health and trauma, and also more broadly as a part of social movement and organizing. So what really brought me here is always this personal journey that is deeply connected to something that is more global, that is more systemic, and that's like the only way I can live my life. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!